We're at a moment where America, the West, Israel are under a kind of cultural assault. And we think that the only long-term answer to the renewal of our culture is through education. The Jews have something to contribute to the renewal and strengthening of American culture at a moment when American culture needs Hebraic remedies for some of our woke disorders.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. Today, we have a fascinating conversation with Eric Cohen of the Tikvah Foundation to discuss an important article he's just published about defending and reviving the spirit of classical Jewish education. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, we would love to hear from you. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. In case you hadn't noticed, there is a war being waged against Western civilization. It's been happening on college campuses, in primary and secondary schools, in the publishing industry, journalism, and even in the classical arts. It spread to our politics and seeped its way into just about every important conversation without most people even noticing. While it can appear to be a very scary trend indeed when it is presented as such by extremist ideologues who pop off on the outlets that are on the margins of our public conversation, the war on the West is at its most effective and insidious when it disguises itself as arguments for positive change, a critique of the sins of the past, or of the now ever-present woke catechism of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The intellectual roots of these arguments and practices that chip away at the foundations of our traditions are Marxist and inherently aimed at toppling the liberal ethos that underpins the historically unique prosperity and freedom that people in Western democracies enjoy. But the discussion about the effort isn't usually framed that way. Instead, it is merely put forward as just a new and better way to understand our history, philosophy, and literature, as well as the Judeo-Christian faith traditions that are also part of what made Western civilization. In the name of inclusion or making the world a better place for minorities or women, we are told to give up our past, or even our understanding of biology, gender, and identity, in exchange for a new, woker belief system that is every bit as much of a religious orthodoxy as any of the faiths the postmodern world is increasingly rejecting. That this mass movement to reject the foundations of Western thought is coming at a moment when, for example, America has never been less racist or sexist isn't merely ironic. It's an indication that what is at work here is not an effort to make us more free, but to actually erase the freedoms rooted in the Western canon. But once we reject the philosophy of the Enlightenment as too tainted by racism or sexism, or give up the veneration of the Founding Fathers and the heroes of our Western history, what are we getting in place of it? Are we carelessly imbibing the new cynical progressive faith on the internet? Few wonder how the freedoms we take for granted will survive in the brave new world the woke left is creating for us. This question is especially poignant for Jews, who are at one and the same time integral authors of the Western tradition, even though it has rejected them in the past. But the notion that Jews shouldn't care about the survival of Western culture and civilization is more than short-sighted. Whether most of us realize it or not, all of the achievements that have made this generation of Jews the freest, as well as the one that the state of Israel has arisen, are linked to the Western tradition and its ability to withstand this war that is being waged on it from without and within it. Some Jews will respond by saying that the only Jewish response is to isolate ourselves from the outside world in our own vital religious tradition that is not dependent on outside forces. But as much as that faith is to be respected, the notion that Jews will not suffer enormously from the collapse of the West is a fantasy. Critical race theory and the diversity, equity, inclusion mindset is a permission slip for anti-Semitism. And that is a problem that will only worsen as these ideologies grow more powerful. In turn, the secular Jewish majority will say that we should rejoice in the death of the Western tradition and embrace its progressive replacement as the future, not realizing that they are mimicking the false optimism and delusional faith in the ideologies of the left that characterized so many European Jews in the early 20th century, who believed that Marxism would produce a better world for Jews as well as everyone else, only to learn that not only was that promise a great lie, but that Jews would be the particular victims of the various brands of toxic totalitarian socialism that arose in the last century before they were, thankfully, beaten down by the enlightened capitalist and free West. In place of either of those paths lies another way of envisioning the future. In a bold and important essay in Mosaic magazine, two Jewish scholars laid out a vision for the rise of a Jewish classical education that offers a better way forward. In their essay, they trace the roots of the synthesis of Western ideas with Jewish traditions back to some of the greatest Jewish thinkers of the past. And they explain how the rise of progressive education, which has largely replaced the classical model, has prized spontaneity over imitation of excellence, dismissed the study of the classics and the learning of multiple language, and replaced the great books with the idolization of relevancy and thereby cut students off from their civilizational roots. They believe that Jewish schools that prioritize the teaching of history, literature, art, philosophy, and political thought, as well as science, is the best way for Jews to remain true to their own traditions, as well as to play a necessary role as a light to the nations, not only for their own sake, but because the fate of the Jews is linked to that of the West. We're pleased to have with us today one of the authors of that important essay. Eric Cohen has been the executive director of the Tikvah Fund since 2007. He was the founder and remains editor-in-large of the New Atlantis and serves as publisher of the Jewish Review of Books and Mosaic. His work has been published in many outlets, and he is the author of In the Shadow of Progress, Being Human in the Age of Technology, and co-editor of The Future Is Now, America Confronts the New Genetics. Eric Cohen, welcome to Top Story.
Jonathan, it's great to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us. I want to start by asking you about your recent Mosaic essay with Tikvah's Rabbi Mitchell Rockland, in which you write about the importance of the spirit of Jewish classical education. For our viewers and listeners, what exactly is that, and why is it important for Jews to care about it now?
Well, I think the first premise is that Jewish ideas, Jewish understandings are central to the best of Western civilization. You know, if you think about who we are as a people, as a culture, as a civilization at our heights, you've got to begin with the Hebrew Bible. You've got to begin with the idea that human beings were created by a single God, summoned to noble and elevated purposes, governed by a moral order, that life has a trajectory that is purposeful, that history means something and matters, and that Jews are at the center of the Western story in a very profound way. Rome may have conquered the Jews, but Jewish ideas ended up conquering the world in very important ways. And certainly that's true if you think about the meaning of America. And so, as we look around today, we're at a moment where America, the West, Israel are under a kind of cultural assault. And we think that the only long term answer to the renewal of our culture is through education. And so, Rabbi Rockland and I were trying to articulate a vision of what we call Jewish classical education that would put Jewish ideas back at the center of the Western story, that would take seriously what Jews have to learn from the best of Western civilization in full, from ancient Greece, from Rome, from the great works of literature and art and culture that have defined our people, and to take this seriously as an American obligation. The Jews have something to contribute to the renewal and strengthening of American culture at a moment when American culture needs Hebraic remedies for some of our woke disorders. So that's the spirit behind the essay.
Yeah. You talk about this in the piece, but a lot of Jews will, I suppose, respond to your call for a return to and a strengthening of the Western canon by saying that the West has been inherently hostile to Jews throughout history, and that our own faith and philosophical traditions need no aid from that of the Greeks and the Romans and the philosophers of the Enlightenment, many of whom were not terribly enlightened when it came to the Jews. Nevertheless, you argue that Jews need Western civilization and it needs us. Why?
That's right. Look, if you look at the great leaders, even just in modern Jewish history, the founders of Zionism, people like Herzl, like Ben Gurion, like Jabotinsky, even like Rav Kook, or if you look at the great thinkers and leaders of religious Judaism in the diaspora, people like Soloveitchik, Schneerson, Heschel, these were Jews who had a proud sense of the importance and majesty of Jewish history and Jewish civilization, all in different ways. But they're also Jews who understand the culture and civilization that they both helped birth and that they're a part of. And our view is, as we think about Jewish education and Jewish culture, we got to have three things in mind. One, obviously, Jews on Torah grounds, on religious grounds, on nationalist grounds, have to resist those ideas and influences that are antithetical to Judaism. You have to have a spirit of resistance for those forces of assimilation that want to undo everything good about Jewish life and culture. Second, though, is you got to integrate the best of the West into the Jewish world. Meaning Jewish ideas have shaped Western civilization, but Jews also have something to learn from these other cultures. You know, think of the moment in the Bible, right, where Moses is advised by Jethro about the need to think differently about how to delegate responsibility. It's a kind of interesting moment where the greatest leader in Jewish history still has something to learn about political order from a non-Jewish figure or a different figure, partial outsider to Hebraism. So we need to resist those influences that want to undermine Judaism. We need to integrate the best of the West. But this is the most important point, which is that Jews have to take a certain responsibility for Western civilization. If you look at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, right, one of the greatest works of artistic genius ever, it's an aesthetic bringing to life of ideas from the Hebrew Bible. Now, Jews often live tragically as outsiders to the West that they helped birth, but today we don't have to. And today, I think the West needs Jews more than ever, and I think we have a contribution to make. You know, if it's words from Leviticus on the Liberty Bell, we should want to proclaim that Liberty Bell in a Jewish way around the world. I think we got to take that responsibility seriously.
Yeah, I think that's a very compelling argument. But I want to take sort of in order, sort of the two strains of contemporary Jewish life that are pushing against it, and which you address in the piece. Let's first talk about the sort of the isolationist Jew, the the Haredi world principally, which has a lot of strength, growing strength, and growing population, both in Israel and in the United States. And their attitude is who cares about the West? We're just doing, we survive on our own. We won't go down with their ship, and they won't save us. Why is that short-sighted?
Well, look, I begin with a position of great respect for the Haredi world, the yeshiva world, the Torah world. These are communities and cultures that are preserving Jewish life in a deep and committed way from generation to generation, and who are taking as their defining, North Star and how they live, the wisdom and ways of the Torah. And they're doing it in a culture that's often hostile to many of the things that they believe in, both culturally and politically. So I have great respect for the Haredi world. And I actually think much of what we're arguing is very sympathetic to the
Hmm.
preservation of
That's
Torah
true.
Judaism. But I think there are a couple things that they ought to be thinking about. One is, if Western culture and civilization collapses all around them, they're not going to be immune from it. The walls are only so high. Walls against social media and the internet, walls against, the shaping influences of modern corporate culture. They are still a part of the modern age. And if everything collapses around them, I think they're going to undermine their own way of life. I'd say second is, if you take seriously the idea that the Jews were summoned to be a light unto the nations, then the purpose of Judaism is not survival alone, though that is the indispensable beginning. The purpose of Judaism is also to spread a moral message to the world and a way of life to the world. And I think who better to take on some of that responsibility than the most committed Torah Jews? And the last thing that I would say is that America is unique, meaning America was, at least in deep ways and in great measure, a Hebraic founding from the beginning, a nation that welcomed Jews as a people and then embraced Jewish ideas as part of the DNA of American civilization. And I think it is a mistake for Torah Jews to see America as just another transient hotel in the diaspora. I think Haredi Jews should see themselves as a people apart, but also a people that can contribute. And I think we should be able to navigate that tension, but also that responsibility.
Yeah, I want to, before we get to sort of the other strain of thought pushing against what you're doing, I want to just sort of drill down a bit more on this idea that I think has gained credence and gained support beyond the Haredi world, certainly, which is to dismiss the idea of American exceptionalism, and that the role of Jews, the place of Jews in this country, is because there has been a rise in anti-Semitism, a noticeable rise, on the left, on the right, that is causing many Jews that, might have in a previous generation not thought this way, to think that the West, and in particular the United States, is no longer safe, and that, sort of all bets are off. How do we answer that concern?
So, look, we have to be, of course, sober about the cultural challenges we face today. There are lots of reasons to be worried as Jews and worried as Americans about what's going on. You look at some of the breakdowns of family life that are going on. You look at the incredibly high rates of depression and despair around America. You look at the low birth rates, not only in America, which is better than most of the West, but throughout the world. Meaning you have whole cultures and civilizations that are basically saying we're not important enough to pass down to the next generation. The only exception, of course, being Israel, which has the highest birth rate in the advanced industrial world. So there are obviously reasons to worry about the West, what we've called wokeism and critical race theory, and a variety of cultural movements that have really begun to shape how we're educating our young people in colleges, for sure, and in elementary and secondary school as well. So there are reasons to be worried, but I think the Jews are always summoned to be hopeful, meaning our very endurance as a kind of message in the bottle of history, that renewal is always possible. And I think Jews can help lead that effort at renewal. So I don't think the right response to an attack on America is despair. The right response to an attack on America is resilience and reaffirmation that America is a noble experiment in liberty, that the Jews have been central to it from the beginning, And that now, the more than ever, I think America needs energetic Jewish talent, Jewish moral energy, Jewish institution building energy, Jewish philanthropic energy to build the great institutions of Judeo-American civilization, if I can coin a phrase. And I think that will actually invigorate Jews. I think that's the other part of the story, which is you mentioned the isolationist wing of American Jewry. Well, of course, the larger constellation of American Jews are the assimilationist wing of American Jewry, Jews that have been severed from any connection to the heroism and meaning and majesty of Jewish life and history. And I think what better way to renew Jewish energy than for young Jews to believe they have a great and important purpose as Americans to help renew our culture and to do it as proud and hopefully more deeply committed Jews. That's our case.
Yeah. Um, Turning to that, secular majority of the Jewish population in the United States, it's clear that many, if not most, seem to think that they are not threatened by what many, I think, are rightly calling a war on the West, its history, its literature, its philosophy, by the new woke cult. And to the extent that they have shucked off their Jewish identity and sense of Jewish peoplehood, especially their connection to Israel, I suppose on some level that might be true. But why is the sort of woke diversity, equity, inclusion catechism and ideas like critical race theory, as well as the efforts to overturn not just statues, but American history itself through efforts like the Fallacious 1619 Project, just to take one example from the New York Times, why is that a particular threat to Jews? And why do even Jews who are not connected, particularly to their faith tradition, need to be alive to this?
Look, think of what happens. You're a young suburban Jew growing up in America. Maybe you had a bar mitzvah, maybe you learned a little Hebrew, but you probably didn't learn very much. You probably don't feel like you're deeply rooted in your Jewish identity. And then you arrive on your average college campus and discover all of a sudden that there's a campaign against you. There's a campaign against you as a part of the Jewish people. There's a campaign against you as a Zionist and, who may have some at least modest sympathy for the Jewish state. And you got to decide, what's your response going to be? Is it going to be, to join the assault against the Jews in the name of, some distorted progressive value system? Is your response going to be to hide and just, pretend like being a Jew doesn't mean anything? Or is your response going to be some amount of moral and intellectual courage, which can only exist when you actually know enough to defend your own people and your own culture and your own civilization? And so, we've got to ask ourselves, well, why have they singled out Jews? Meaning, why is there this kind of targeted assault on Zionism, on Judaism, that seems irrational? And I don't, it's not because Jews look funny, and it's not, because Jews have, weird names. I think it comes to some very fundamental things that the Jews in Israel represent. That Jews at our best represent a kind of traditional moral order, meaning a way of understanding human life as, a sacred covenant, ordered by God with a set of moral commandments that shape our lives, including a way of understanding men and women and family life. Well, that's the first target of wokeism, are those things. And so the Hebraic Jew is the very symbol of what wokeism wants to undermine. That's one reason, I think, for the assault. I think a second reason for the assault is Israel, which I think is one of the noblest forms of nationalism the world has ever seen, represents the idea that nationalism is a good thing, rightly understood. Not all nationalisms are good, but Jewish nationalism is good. And Israel is a reminder that we still live in a real world where there are threats and there is the need for real power and there's need to defend ourselves. And some progressives don't like that stark reminder. Jews have been successful in America, successful by no special pleading, but by taking advantage of the riches of American liberty from generation to generation. You don't have to go far back in most Jewish families to discover people that grew up in real poverty And now a lot of Jews have been quite successful in American life. So there are all kinds of ways in which the Jews get targeted. But the only answer to anti Semitism and anti Zionism is a proud affirmation of Jewish exceptionalism, with humility, not out of pride, but with a sense that Jews have a sacred inheritance. We should understand it, we should embody it, we should defend it. And that's what we're trying to pass down to young people in the work that Tikvah does.
Yeah, I think that's a very compelling argument. But of course, it does go, right into the face of sort of the secular liberal ethos in this country, which tends to regard all sectarianism, any sectarian identity, certainly that which is connected to what we now call white privilege, with great disdain, and even the idea of asking Jews to be faithful to their people and to continue their traditions strikes a lot of people as somehow connected to racism. That which is very pervasive, partly because of this, sort of woke war on the West, but in a country where sort of every identities, separate, tribal identities tended to be broken down. Jews seem to be have always been sort of the champions of the universalist approach. This more particularist, albeit with a truly universal goal, is a hard sell for a lot of Jews today, isn't it?
I mean, look, I actually think Jews are in a unique position to help educate America and the world about the right way to balance both particularism and sort of universal moral aspirations, right? On the one hand, the Jews are a particular people. We have a thick sense of community at our best. We have a set of, a calendar, a set of rituals, a way of living that binds us together, a sense of a shared history. And that set of particular commitments is what makes a culture a culture. The genius of America, and I think also the genius of Jews, is that it also embraces pluralism within a broad moral order. But American pluralism means a mosaic of particular cultures. Like, that's what I think America is at its best. That all have a shared appreciation for American liberty and the space that America provides for those cultures to flourish. But as a Jew, I celebrate, the varieties of particularism that give different Americans their identity, as long as it coexists and deepens their appreciation for America as the place that provides that space for cultural uniqueness and distinctness. And so I think Jews are in a unique position to help embody that in the best sense, as a particular people with a way of life that is unique, that are also fully at home in America and have something to contribute to America. And would that dozens of such noble particularisms would flourish, America would be a better place. America would be stronger if we had, a reinvigoration of those thick identities. So I think we can help show the way about what American federalism, American pluralism is at its best.
Mm. Yes, I think that's right. But I want to go back to a bit to the phrase about being a light unto the nations. There are always going to be Jews who are going to say, well, can't the nations take care of themselves without the Jews? But I think probably the biggest problem is that, a large number, if not, a plurality of Jews see the obligation to be a light into the nations in the light of a, sort of social justice political agenda, which for many Jews is now indistinguishable from Judaism, or they believe it is Judaism and that everything else, isn't. And which, to the extent that, the social justice agenda, which, goes under the, sort of the category of what they call tikkun olam, which is sort of twisted a bit from its traditional meaning, in some ways it goes against it, because these are the same organizations, both religiously and politically, that are endorsing some of the worst of the woke, catechism that we referenced previously about critical race theory and DEI. which kind of works directly against the whole idea of classical Jewish education and indeed of reviving the traditions of the Western canon.
Look, if the Jews have many, I think, messages we can bring to the world, but I think the most important has to do with the importance of family life, and what it means to preserve something from generation to generation. And if you want to look at the heart of the crisis of the West, it is a rupture in the nature of the family, and I think that's a place where we can be a light unto the nations, and actually reminding our civilization that life at its best is ordered from one generation to the next, and that means having a real understanding of how men and women and families form and what it means to hand something down to children. So I think there are lots of different ways of thinking about the message that we can bring to the world. I think in a deeper sense, the Jews changed history. Why did we change history? Because we brought to the world this idea that God has chosen the Jews as a covenantal people, and that covenant is God's bet on man to build a history that matters. And that's why we believe history is not just a story of the eternal recurrence of the same. It's not just tragedy after tragedy written into our natures. We actually believe in the heroic possibilities of a history that is forward looking and redemptive. And Israel is the greatest light in that sense. So, how else can we be a light unto the nations? Well, what brighter light than a people that came back to life after, centuries of exile, near slaughtered, who now have created a noble nation that has the highest birth rate in the world and a sense of vigor about its own future. There's lots of debates going on in Israel. We can talk about that if you want. But what you have is a vigorous nation state that believes it has something to defend. And I think as goes Israel, so goes the West. As go the Jews, so goes the West. If we're able to preserve Jewish life in America, the West is probably a pretty healthy place. If we're able to preserve Israel in the world of the nations, then the world is probably a reasonably healthy place. We are the litmus test of Western history, and we should take that responsibility seriously, and it should shape how we think about how we're going to educate our young people. That's the core of the argument we make in this essay, is that we have to think differently about Jewish education, because that's the long game. The heroes of Jewish history have always been the school builders, and we need a new generation of school builders and reformers to take this spirit of Jewish responsibility to the West into every classroom from a young age forward.
Yeah, that's great, because that's my next question, is to really kind of switch to talking more about education. In your essay, you pay particular attention to the way progressive education as a school of thought replaced the classical model of learning. Why was that a bad thing, and what impact has it had on our society?
Look, the classical model of learning is something that has shaped how cultures and educations have reared their young, certainly their future leaders, for many generations, and it came with the belief that we can learn from the best of the past, that the heights of excellence in our past can be a North Star for our future, that we ought to immerse ourselves in the great languages and literatures and cultures of the Western tradition, Greece, Rome, and Hebraic, and that we need to tutor ourselves in human excellence, and that requires real mastery. And so, the classical tradition put a big emphasis on learning languages, learning Latin, learning Greek, learning other Romance languages, learning Hebrew, as the gateway to culture. It put great emphasis on actually memorizing important works, both to help show us how to write and how to think by imitating excellence and then learning how to be excellent ourselves, but also by creating what's been called the kind of furniture of the mind, that you have in your mind elevated reference points to make sense of the world, to make sense of human nature, to make sense of our quest for meaning. And so this is the classical tradition at its best. that we believe can be integrated in a unique way with the best of Jewish learning, Jewish culture, Jewish civilization. Now, what was the progressive break? Well, it's a complicated story, but progressivism in education, began as a movement, in part to try to make education more practical, more relevant. Some of this coincided with the kind of birth of the industrial age, and understandably, they wanted to make workers. They wanted to train workers. Well, that sort of narrowed their vision. At the same time, and by the way, I'm all for training people in the trades. I have great respect for that. I think it's actually important and been undervalued in education. But you also have to educate people in their culture. You have to educate them as citizens. You have to shape their souls, and we can't lose that. And progressivism tried to replace the best of the classical tradition with, I would say, what it would call a more student-centered learning, putting the child at the center of his own education, focusing on, the development of self-esteem rather than the pursuit of mastery, which brings a higher level of self-esteem. And what it did gradually is it undercut our civilizational moorings. So you had people that were educated as if they had no past to be tools of the future, rather than people who are educated as deeply rooted in the past so they could build a noble future. And that's, I think, the problem with progressive education. And then when you had the revolts and the cultural revolts of the 60s that have now basically reshaped everything over the last many decades, the kind of counterculture that has taken over our institutions, we've been left in the crisis culturally that we find ourselves in. And I think what is hopeful is there's been an incredible counter reaction over the last couple of decades in the Christian world, in the charter world, with hundreds of these classically oriented schools that have been founded around the country. And we think Jews ought to be a central part of that movement because we think we have something unique to offer. So it's a complicated story, but that's the thrust of, I think, the history and the tension between the classical model and the progressive model.
Yeah, that was a good simplification. That was a good explanation. Thanks. Jews, of course, have always had their own great books curriculum. Why do we, as a people, need the traditional Western great books that, I speak as somebody who went to Columbia a while ago, so that was part of my, college education. But that so many now characterize as merely the works of dead white males that have nothing to say to us today. Why is that important for Jews? Why do we need to educate young Jews in these classic works?
Well, look, I want to start by being unequivocal about something, which is that the most important great books of the Western tradition are our books, namely beginning with the Hebrew Bible. And so any Jewish classical education begins with immersion in Hebrew language and then mastery of our own biblical story. And that means understanding the arc of Jewish history, and it also means understanding the meaning of Jewish history, right? What is the Bible about? Well, it's about a lot of things, but one of the things it's about is setting off Hebraic civilization against its rivals, its Babylonian rival and its Canaanite rival, and all these other cultures that were pagan in all kinds of different ways. And we offered an alternative, a God-oriented, commandment-oriented alternative. Well, young Jews should understand that because it's shaped the West and it's also their own culture. But why do we need more than that? Well, I think we have to understand, in all senses, that one, we helped birth Western culture, often permeated through Christianity, but we should understand the heights of human achievement in music and art and literature and architecture, and those things I think will elevate us as humans and elevate us as Jews. And when it comes to the practical arts, like politics, like economics, like strategy, I think if you're a Jewish statesman, you have something to learn from Adam Smith, Edmund Burke, and Thucydides. And I think we should want to educate people to appreciate that in the deepest sense, the meaning of Western history, I think, is Hebraic. But in a practical sense and in an aesthetic sense, we have much to learn from other thinkers outside the Hebraic tradition. We have to think about how to integrate them into our Jewish way of life. And so that's the spirit of Jewish classical education. It begins with our own incredible tradition that ought to be appreciated as Jews and by the world as a Hebraic contribution. But it also recognizes that we have important wisdom to import from the outside, and we ought to do it in a uniquely Jewish way, but we ought to have the humility to do it. And that, if just as we've done in many fields, think of the field of medicine, right? So the field of medicine is obvious. Obviously, there have been incredible breakthroughs in medicine, and medicine, I think, at its best, is very much a kind of man acting in the image of God to heal people, to fix nature when it's broken, to redeem, through medical art, a sick child. What is more noble than that? But the arts of medicine, you can't rely on the Talmud alone to master modern medicine. It's something valuable that you can import. Well, I think that's also true in other areas of human learning, and we should do that wisely, Jewishly, but energetically.
Mm. Yeah. Well, give us a little more detail about what your model for an ideal Jewish classical education consists of.
So, look, I think, you have to begin with young people as early as possible, pre-K, kindergarten. And I think in the early years, the most important distinctive thing, I think, is immersion in Hebrew. Meaning you have to, if you're focusing on American Jews for the moment, um, I think Hebrew is the gateway, to Jewish culture, to Torah culture. And I say this as someone who grew up outside of the Jewish day school world, who didn't learn Hebrew, who regrets every day that I didn't have that education when I was younger, and have tried to give it to my own kids now. But you begin with Hebrew immersion, and then you have to give people the tools to actually master the best of Western and American and Jewish culture. So you're teaching them in the classical way grammar and logic and rhetoric. You're having them memorize from an early age some of the best poetry of the Western tradition, so they learn how to think beautifully and think clearly and write clearly. You're exposing them to beautiful art and beautiful music as young kids. And then you're exposing them to history, but with a sense not that the West is perfect or that America is perfect, but that this is a very noble inheritance, an exceptional inheritance, and that our young Jews should appreciate and take responsibility for American and Western civilization rather than see it as a source of sin and, failure and despair. We should be sober about the imperfections of our own history, and Jews have often been on the wrong side of the imperfections of Western history. But we can also appreciate what it is at its best and try to turn it toward good moral ends. And so you want to try to take people through that progression. And then you've got to figure out, and it's not easy because time is obviously hard, how to give this in parallel with the highest level Judaics instruction. Certainly a very, very deep mastery, as I said earlier, of the Hebrew Bible, and also an immersion in rabbinic learning. But then I think you've got to do one other thing, which is you've got to have some room for different students to migrate to the arenas where they have the greatest potential. And so every young Jew should have a serious exposure to the rabbinic tradition. But that doesn't mean all young Jews are going to be rabbinic scholars. Some may be able to make a contribution to Jewish life that takes them into other fields of learning where they can contribute as Jews, but where they immerse themselves in those modes of mastery. So that's the broad spirit of it. And I actually think it's a mode of learning that should be appealing to the full spectrum of Jews, by which I mean, on the one hand, religious Jews in the yeshiva world and the modern Orthodox world who want a form of general studies that is anti-woke, that is pro-Hebraic, that is grounded in high culture. That should be very appealing to the yeshiva world and the modern Orthodox world. And we've already had wonderful experiments with this in partner schools in that space. But I also think this mode of education will be increasingly appealing to more assimilated and secular Jews who have been mugged by the reality of progressive education and who are seeing what is going on in some of these elite, quote unquote, secular private schools and in public schools, and they don't like it. And they're looking for something better. And They've been mugged by reality during COVID, which kind of lifted opened the window shade to what was going on in our schools. And I think there's a hunger for this kind of Jewish classical education that is ripe for building. I think this is a time to build.
Yeah, I think that's very true. um, but switching from the curriculum, which seems like a very strong program, if there's anything that I've learned reporting and writing about American Jews, it is that the problem with promoting Jewish education, especially day schools, or specifically Jewish outlets, is not solely one of finances, which is one of the issues that we focused on, although that is a real challenge. It's that you can't pay most American Jews to send their kids to a Jewish school. It's not the question that they can't pay for it, it's that you can't pay them to do it. In that atmosphere, along with the strength of the Haredi world, even in the United States, how will we get more Jews to embrace classical Jewish education? Is it that, as you say, they'll just be, mugged by reality because they're rejecting the woke education at a time when woke education is becoming more pervasive than ever?
Look, I think I start with the positive, which is we've seen an incredible growth. I mean, if you step back a little bit and look at, American Jewry since the end of World War II, the day school movement was barely existent at that point. And look at how it's grown. And so we've seen an incredible building of Jewish educational institutions across the denominational spectrum, but certainly in the Orthodox world where there's been the most growth. And that's an incredible achievement. And that's something that ought to be celebrated. In terms of how do we reach more Jews, look, I think there are a bunch of things that are hopefully, running in our favor. One is what I said earlier, which is I think there's an increasing sense of disillusionment with the quote unquote mainstream educational options. And I think some sector of Jews are seeing this and they're looking for something else. And they're beginning to draw linkages between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and progressive educational models and the sort of insanity of, teaching, fourth graders about transgenderism and all this stuff. And they're saying, what is going on? We want something else. This isn't what we're looking for. So I think there's an opportunity there. I think at a policy level, I think what we're seeing in states around the country, and there's another angle that I think is very important, is I think you're going to see a voucher movement that is going to capitalize private education and create a kind of moment of school building that is unlike anything we've seen. This is going to happen in Arizona and Texas and Florida. Hopefully it'll happen also in states like New York, but you're going to see a school building renaissance that will include a renaissance of Jewish school building. And the other thing I would say is I think within the yeshiva world, I think there's going to be an increasing recognition that they should have excellence in general studies. And the way to do that is these more classical models, meaning it's not enough for them to rent public school teachers to teach history in the afternoon, because those public school teachers that they're renting are importing stuff that is entirely hostile to the yeshiva worldview. And so what you need are leaders in the yeshiva world to recognize, of course, our first aim and purpose, as it should be, is to impart Torah Judaism and a Torah way of life. But we should also teach young Jews about American history, and we also should teach young Jews how to read and write, and we should also teach young Jews that they can appreciate the best of Western culture, whether it's beautiful music or great writing or great literature, and that's much better than the progressive nonsense that they'll get if they just simply, quote unquote, meet New York State standards. Those are not the standards we should be trying to meet. We should meet our own civilizational standards. And so, look, we write about this, but there are real precedents for this in Jewish history. The most remarkable period being in the mid-1800s in Germany, where Samson Raphael Hirsch, one of the great defenders of Torah Judaism, built a network of Jewish classical schools that was doing this in the right way, and that tragically got destroyed, in the Holocaust. I think we can have a rebirth of that here, and we should do it. And I'll end with this, on this question. we can't expect that we're going to capture every American Jew. Meaning we have to accept there'll be some amount of assimilation, and that's tragic, but that's the reality. The great thinker Milton Himmelfarb predicted that the future of American Jewry is fewer but better Jews. Well, hopefully the fewer can be more rather than less, but we should also focus on the better. And I think Jewish classical learning is central to the formation of quote unquote better Jews.
Yeah, that's very true and very good. And I think you're exactly right about the importance of school choice. We could do a whole hour on school choice, and hopefully we will
I think
soon.
this
But
is
I
just
wanted,
not to hold an hour, but just to put another plug in. And
sure,
I
go ahead.
think the promotion of school choice is the most important policy issue for American Jews. And I think we are at a moment where certain court decisions and certain the combination of a Supreme Court and federal court that is friendly to this and has made it permissible, and I think an increasing disillusionment with the public school system in many areas of the country. This is the Renaissance moment, and I think Jews should put as much of their energy as they can behind the school choice moment. And I actually think over the next few decades, it's going to drive big demographic change in America. Meaning, I think we're going to see a shift in Jewish population in America from New York and California and New Jersey, states that are less likely to embrace the school choice revolution, to states like Florida, Texas, and Arizona that are at the forefront of it. And that will capitalize a renaissance of Jewish education in a way that is very important. And I can't overemphasize enough that at policy level, this is the great fight of our hour.
I think that's I can't disagree with that, and I hope that turns out to be prescient. Let's turn for a moment now, just to the Tikvah Foundation itself. I want to ask you a bit about that. Tikvah, I know, is doing a lot these days, but what is it that the average reader or viewer ought to know about it, and why is it important?
Well, I appreciate the question. At its heart, Tikvah's got two guiding principles. The first is that ideas really matter. And so we try to invest in the best Jewish thinking, both about the urgent issues of our time, whether it's the defense of religious freedom, the fight against anti-Semitism, the preservation of Israeli, democracy, confronting the threats that Israel faces, the full set of things that the Jewish people face. Our view is you need, the best thinking, but you also need the best thinking about the enduring questions of Jewish life, and the cultural lifeblood of the Jewish people, recovering the wisdom of the Hebrew Bible, recovering the wisdom of Jewish literature. And so Tikvah's invested in a wide array of programs and activities, magazines, books, podcasts, online courses that try to bring those ideas to life, and with some really terrific thinkers like Meir Soloveichik and Ruth Weiss and Dan Polisar and a wide range of people. The second and the real heart and soul of what we do is education, meaning the belief that you gotta identify young people that have leadership potential, and try to cultivate them in those areas of learning that are essential to Jewish leadership. Obviously, that's Jewish history and Zionist history, but it's also political thought and moral philosophy and culture and strategy and economics. And so what Tikvah's tried to do over the last many, many years is build a network of educational institutions, both here and in Israel, that cultivate Jewish leaders who want to go into the arena and defend Jewish interests. And that's been our model. And we do it in America and we do it in Israel. And the next phase of this, and why we wrote this article in Mosaic, is to not only try to educate thousands of young Jews, which we've been doing, but to try to actually seed a new network of Jewish educational institutions that can be enduring and that can shape the landscape of Jewish learning in America and around the world. So that's in a nutshell what we do, and both, like I said, both in America and in Israel.
Yeah, that last part about seeding a new wave of Jewish education, I think it's very hopeful and very ambitious, but also very important. Tikva has played a role, as you just mentioned, in supporting Zionism in the United States, but also in promoting the Western tradition in Israel, where it has not always been widely known. Explain exactly how that works, and why is it that Tikva has been part of the debate about judicial reform in Israel, and what does that mean?
So look, as I said, the spirit of Tikva, both in America and Israel, is ideas and education. That ideas matter, and that educating young people, especially future leaders, matters. And that's the same in both countries. I think our strategy is a little different, meaning in America, we are fundamentally focused on the kinds of Jewish classical learning that we've talked about, and really focused on trying to now start as young as possible, because our view is if you don't reach American Jews early, that the danger of losing them is much greater. And the earlier you get them, the more promising that learning can be. In Israel, the challenge is different. It's a cultural and civilizational debate about the future of Israeli society. It's a set of big public arguments about the nature of Israeli democratic life, and so we've acted a little bit more like a think tank in Israel, trying to advance a set of arguments about economic policy, about the legal reform question, about Israeli national security. And over the last few years, we've become a pretty big player in the conversations in Israel about its own future. And in fact, many of the figures that are now, central to those debates, are alums of Tikva. I mean, people that, literally 5-8 years ago were studying in Tikva institutes, were students in our programs, and now they're in the Knesset, they're in major positions of Israeli public life, and including on the very hot issue of legal reform. So that's how we operate a little bit differently in the two countries.
Yeah, let's just take for a moment to the question of judicial reform. Um, the amount of I think disingenuous propaganda about that issue that is promoted in the media is just mind-boggling. But explain to us why reforming the judiciary is not a destruction of democracy, and that the Tikva. I mean, outlets like Haaretz have identified Tikva as the evil geniuses behind the new push towards dictatorship. Why is that completely wrong?
Well, look, for anybody interested in a very in-depth, careful overview of the history and the implications of this legal reform debate, I would recommend an essay that came out yesterday by Evelyn Gordon in Mosaic magazine, which is one of our publications, that really describes this in incredible depth. And I won't try to pretend to be an expert on legal reform, but look, this goes back to the 90s, and it goes back to a judicial revolution in Israel where Justice Barak basically decided that the Israeli Supreme Court was going to redefine the nature of Israeli society. It was, in a fundamental way, a very anti-democratic project. The belief that um, he needed to be, and the court needed to be, the ultimate arbiter of Israelis' policy choices and value choices, as opposed to it being argued out with all the messiness of democratic life. And in Israel, that is a nation that does have many sub-communities and many factions and many, different, arguments about what Israel stands for. And Barak took onto to the court a set of powers that were, I think, wildly overreaching. And there's been an argument to try to reform and push back against that that's been building over many, many years. This didn't come out of the blue. And it centers on things like, should the Supreme Court appoint itself? This doesn't happen almost anywhere in the world, where judges get to appoint their own replacements. It gets to issues like, what are the powers of the court to overturn legislation in the Knesset? Should the court have a kind of unlimited power to simply decide that everything is a judicial matter as opposed to a policy or political matter, and impose its own will on the country? It has to do with how powerful are the legal advisors within the government. Should they be able to basically overrule and dictate to cabinet ministers, who are the representatives of the electorate, what is permissible and not permissible policy? And I think many people believe that we needed to restore a sense of democratic balance in Israel by restraining the court and reasserting a proper separation of powers, a tricky matter in a nation that doesn't actually have a constitution, and where some of its quote unquote basic laws were passed, by very, very small minorities of the Knesset, in votes where half the members weren't even present. Now, you can debate the details of the reforms, and it's obviously, we're in the middle of this complicated debate. But the idea that trying to reestablish in the name of democratic self-governance the balance of powers in Israel is anti-democratic seems to me a very weak argument. And I think it comes from a place that as Israeli society has changed, as it's become more religious and less secular, more traditional, more nationalist in certain profound ways, there are people that don't like that. And they're entitled to their opinion, and they're entitled to try to mobilize and organize and vote. But the idea that they're going to claim that they're the champions of democracy, when in fact, what these reforms are trying to do is to establish, as I said, a kind of a restored democratic self-governance, I don't find that to be a very compelling argument. And I think the hysteria is unhealthy. And I think what will hopefully happen should happen in democracy is the players in that country will have an argument about this, and they will come to some reasonable compromise that, as best as possible, approximates the will of the people of the Jewish state. And I think that's still the likeliest outcome here.
Yeah, I agree with you about that. Eric, I want to thank you so much for coming on today, for your insights on these very important issues, and for telling us more about Tikvah's great work. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, or on JBS TV, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen and watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.